congregation with no geographical boundary, working toward creating a global spiritual community rooted in profound love, which cultivates wonder, imagination, and the courage to act. Adapting to the COVID-19 pandemic has been difficult for many bricks and mortar congregations. Early on in the pandemic, we were in a unique position to assist many congregations with the transition. We hosted special episodes of The VUU, provided advice and counseling to religious professionals, and trained congregations for live streaming worship, all while providing robust online programming for our members. From worship to covenant groups, from classes to pastoral care, and from our monthly magazine to our letter writing ministry, we have found ways to build connection and community even through the screen. We have been a model for ministry on the margins, providing services for isolated Unitarian Universalists, becoming a spiritual lifeline for our members in prison, and investing in innovative ministry. We know better than anyone how deep and meaningful connections can be formed even from a distance. Unitarian Universalists have faced many challenges in these times, and we continue to persevere and to fight for justice and equity for all people, especially during moments of crisis. We are proud to be a leader in this faith movement, and we invite you to get involved in our ministry. We strive to be a place where anyone from anywhere can find spiritual refuge anytime they need it. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Larger Fellowship. We are so excited to bring you an all-new episode of The VUU. The VUU is a weekly Unitarian Universalist talk show discussing important faith-based topics from an anti-racist, anti-oppressive, and multicultural perspective. Every Thursday for the past 7 years, we have welcomed guests from every corner of the world. Our guests are writers, scholars, activists, and religious thought leaders who are shaping Unitarian Universalism and society for the 21st century and beyond. I hope today's show inspires you. Hope it builds your faith. Hope it gives you perspective to see the power of Unitarian Universalism at work in your life. Enjoy the message.
Our hosts of The VUU are out this week on retreat. Today's episode will be a little different than you may be used to. We're going to be pulling conversations from the vault on voting rights, organizing, movement building, and how our Unitarian Universalist faith plays into these actions. First, we welcome Desmond Meade from episode 246 to speak about Florida's Amendment 4, the successful restoration of voting rights for formerly incarcerated individuals. Desmond was recently awarded the MacArthur Fellowship, commonly known as a Genius Grant. I'm going to pass it to Reverend Meg Riley, former host of The VUU, to get us started.
Well, let's move to our guests. I'm really excited about today's show because in the midst of good news and bad news coming out of the fall election, there was some really good news from Florida that reflected some really good organizing that went on. And Desmond Meade, I hear you were in the center of all that. So I would love to hear your take on how you did that, because hopefully other states can learn from Florida.
Well, listen, and I'm glad you said that. And first of all, let me thank you all for having me on today. It's definitely an honor and a privilege to be in the company of the UUs, right? Because you guys make it happen. Unitarian Universalists have been strong supporters of this movement from day one. I remember back in the day with Reverend Gail Tapscott, down in South Florida, inviting me to speak to her congregation, all the way up to getting people like Brigham Johnson, who is a force to be reckoned with. It's been an amazing ride in Sarasota, just and other parts of the state, just meeting some beautiful people and doing some amazing work. Let me tell you, so what we've seen, and I like to start off by saying that what this world and this state was able to witness on November 6th was something that was remarkable, something that was beautiful, something that was transformational. You know, Amendment 4 got over 5.1 million votes, and that's over 1 million more votes than any candidate on the ballot receives, right? And the beautiful thing about it was that those 5.1 million votes that we got, none of those votes was based on hate. None of those votes was based on fear, but rather those votes was based on love, forgiveness, and redemption. And so, but for a moment, the state of Florida and this country got to see love winning the day. In this, in the age that we're in now, with the divisiveness and all of the hate that surrounds us, and the partisan back and forth, which nobody wins, to think that an issue as so-called controversial as felon voting rights being able to pass with overwhelming support is nothing short of miraculous. And I tell you, it speaks to the fact that this campaign started out on the right foot, because it started from a spiritual space, right? And from a spiritual space, first thing it connected with was with people. That this is about people over politics, people over race, people over hate, people over all of that negative stuff. And we connected with people along the lines of humanity,
So can you deepen into how you did that? Because
that's it right there.
You did it in very strategic ways.
Yeah, and believe it or not, I think it was a natural inclination that we followed a natural path. We didn't follow a man-made path. We didn't follow a political path. We followed a natural path. And that natural path told us that the issues that we were dealing with impacted people from all walks of life, from all political persuasions, from all racial backgrounds, and that the solution to it would be to bring together people from all walks of life. And because I was a person of faith, I was immediately taken to the passage in the Bible when Christ was on the cross, and when there was a criminal that was next to him that asked him to be saved, and I always tell folks that Jesus didn't tell him he had to wait 5 or 7 years. What Jesus said was, "This day you shall enter into paradise." And that interchange right there actually spoke to the heart of all faith, whether it's Judaism, whether it was Christianity, whether it was Islam. It spoke to this very basic foundational concept of forgiveness, redemption, and restoration. And so that's how we moved forward. We moved forward in that light and lifting up people. And so we refused to be labeled a bipartisan movement, because we weren't. We were an organic grassroots movement that welcomed and enjoyed bipartisan support. And we were able to get people who the experts said was going to be our enemies, and they end up endorsing. How do you get the Koch brothers to endorse this? How do you get the Christian Coalition to endorse this? How do we get, several of the young Republican clubs in Florida to endorse this? Because this was put together along the lines of people, along the lines of humanity. I got great examples of that doesn't even relate to the ballot initiative, but it speaks to why we were successful. And you could all relate to this, right? Give you 2 examples. Number one of the most beautiful times that you see humanity at work is after a natural disaster, right? After the hurricane, people come together. They don't care about how you voted. They don't care about what you look like. What they care about is another human being that's in need. And those are those moments, man, where we see humanity or our country at its finest. Just to get even a little closer personal, we're driving down the street and we see an accident on the side of the road, and there's somebody laying down there, and we decide to stop and help, and we get out the car and we run up to them. The first question that we're not going to ask them, did you vote for Donald Trump? You know what I'm saying? We're not going to ask them that. We're not going to ask them how much money did you make? Do you own a business? You know, we're not asked. What are we asking them? Are you okay? And how can I help? That is humanity at its finest. And that was the spirit in which our campaign embraced. And that's why it allowed us to bring people from all walks of life together in such a form that no one dared attack us, because there was nothing to attack. What they was going to say, you know, how could they speak out against some basic tenets that lays the foundation for all of our faiths? And so we were able to, and that's why when you see, you know, we have right now Governor DeSantis, he's our governor. You know, what we know is this, even though that race was decided by around 30,000 votes, over 1 million people who voted for our amendment also voted for him. The thing about over 1 million of people who voted for our current governor also voted for this amendment. And so it showed that it was able to appeal across all spectrums, in spite of the fact that with no opposition, but folks in the back of their head were saying, oh, this is a Democrat thing, or this is a progressive ploy. But the reality of it, for once, we've seen people vote for their self-interest instead of against their self-interest because they wanted to vote along party lines. And so that was a beautiful thing. I believe that, you know, Dr. Martin Luther King, you know, we just got through celebrating his legacy. But one of the things that always stuck with me was that what he said about you, how you couldn't drive out hate with hate. You know, you couldn't drive out fear with fear. That how that love is that all empowering force that is able to drive out, you know, the hate and the fear. That light drives out darkness. You know, and I do believe that there's a secret sauce that's there that other states can look to, that this country can look to. And I'm hoping that this win could be that spark that slowly turns that big ship around and starts to change its course, that we don't have to be at each other's throats, because that gets nothing done. That if we can just only seek to find that common bond, that common bond along the lines of humanity with each other, and transcend partisan bickering and racial insecurities or anxieties, that we're capable of moving major political issues. Because what we just did in Florida is tremendous. That's going to have a sizable impact on this country for decades to come, right? And we did it with love. And so that's our thing. And then so what happened, what comes around after that, you know, we had the media that tried to stoke up fears. You know, I almost feel like Donald Trump on this one, but, you know, the media was actually creating stories where none existed. And they were creating this sense of fear that, you know, they had some folks thinking that supervisor of elections was going to have barricades in front of their offices and prevent returning citizens from going to register to vote on January 8th. And the reality was the exact opposite was true, that all throughout the state of Florida, some offices even had balloons put up to welcome us. It was a huge celebration. It was a celebration of expanding democracy. And it was also, once again, a celebration of love, because the same people who voted for this amendment out of love went with their loved ones to witness them registering to vote. You know, and we had a guy who voted, who registered. The last time he voted, he voted for John F. Kennedy. Could you believe that? It's been that long since he voted. We've had people who registered for the first time because they lost the right to vote before they even was old enough to vote. And when they went to go register, guess what? They went with their son who just turned 18. And so father and son was registering together. And it brought tears to my eyes. I mean, so many folks throughout the state was like shedding tears of joy. You know, it was a momentous moment. Matter of fact, I'm gonna tell you how it was. It was so huge that in many media markets, because the day that we were allowed to register for the first time was also the day that the governor was sworn into office. that story got second billing to our story of love. In many media markets, he had a small section, and we had the front page, entire top of the section there, and they're talking about returning citizens registering for the first time, and the confetti in some of the offices and the balloons, and just, it was a joyous occasion. I think it was a great time for our country. We've seen folks. And one of the things that I told folks when we was doing the campaign was, listen, we're fighting just as hard for that person who wished they could vote for Donald Trump as we are for that person that wished they could have voted for Barack Obama. At the end of the day, we believe that every American citizen, right, once they paid their debt, should have the opportunity to be able to vote. And when we seen people coming out of the woodworks on January 8th to register to vote, that's exactly what we saw. One of my favorite moments was when I was in the parking lot and I hugged Brett Duval. It's on Facebook. It's on my Facebook Live. Brett Duval is a conservative voter. He loves Donald Trump. He's a hunter, but guess what? He's my brother. And we were united together along the fact that we both had paid our debts and wanted to re-enter into society. And just to see he and I hugging, we didn't see race. We didn't see, political differences, if there are any, but we didn't see any of that. What we saw was another human being. We saw a child of God, and that was almost that same image of when you seen that during the aftermath of the hurricane that hit Texas, when you seen that African American with the boat rescuing the white guy that stopped to let the white guy go back and get his Confederate flag, right? That even though we know what that flag stood for, that African American guy was able to overlook that for that moment, because what he seen before he saw that flag was that there was another human being that was in need, right? And that to me is something that we must continue to embrace as we're moving forward. We're still working through some implementation issues. At first, our legislature and the governor erroneously thought that we needed implementing legislation to implement Amendment 4. Most of what he was saying was just out of plain ignorance. He didn't know. And the people who the media was talking to were people who had nothing to do with the campaign, had nothing to do with the clemency process. And they were talking just to appear like they knew what they were talking about, but they were saying the wrong things. And the media knew that, and they wanted to play that because at the end of the day, that's how they make their money, by selling stories. It has to be sensational or controversy in order for them to actually be relevant. And so we were able to overcome that and continue to move forward. Our organization is constantly in conversation with the leadership, both conservative and progressive leadership in the state. And we are slowly moving issues forward. People have registered. There are a lot of supervisor of elections offices that have experienced a spike in registration. And we're looking to actually launch a much larger and more comprehensive registration effort in the state. We want to be deliberate because we want to make sure that we're not just registering people. We want to make sure that people who are registered actually turn out and vote, because that is what makes our democracy vibrant, when they're voting, not when they're registered, but when they're voting. And you're right, someone asked me the other day, how do you talk to Republicans? And I looked at them and I thought for a long while, really contemplated that question. And my response was, I talk to people. And, I do believe that we have the ability now in Florida, because of what we're able to do with 1.4 million potential new voters in a state where a congressional race decided by 15,000 votes, a gubernatorial race by 30,000, and the presidential by 100,000. We have over 1.4 million now people, and about 2 million of their family members who don't vote, who didn't vote, but voted, but came out to vote for their loved ones. All right, so we have this this constituency of voters now that have the ability to shake up the status quo, to unrig this system, and to have both sides really rethink or go back to their drawing board and come back out knowing that they have to earn our votes. They have to move issues along. They have to learn how to work together and not get caught up in what we're seeing today, to where there's actually almost like a stalemate and nothing is getting done because both sides are so entrenched. And I think that in the Bible they always talk about how the least shall be first. How God always uses the least among a group of people to bring about the biggest change. I think that now these folks who was once considered the scourge of the earth could be the ones that can actually help this country get back to doing business the right way. And I'm looking forward to that. I think that that you all can play a real role in this, and not only just helping with our registration, but helping to drive that narrative that there is a greater force out there that can overcome the hate and the fear that is so prevalent in our society. And if we embrace the returning citizens and allow them that space to experience this process, as well as be the lead in this process, I think that there are so many great things that's going to come from that. And so in closing, I want to just thank you all again. You guys were, in the words of from the streets, you guys were off the chain as it relates to really helping out, in our efforts. I have the receipts. I have all the receipts. I know every UU church or chapter that mailed in petitions to me. I have them on record. And you guys were amazing. Let me just share this one thing real quick that I thought was also amazing feat. We ran the largest faith-based in congregational engagement campaign that this country has ever seen, where we had over 827 congregations of faith participate in Let My People Vote congregational campaign. Now, let me tell you the significance of it. We had the synagogues, we had Islamic mosques, we had conservative Christians, we had Latino conservatives, we had African Americans, we had UUs. All of those religions actually came together under one banner, one voice.
Next, we speak with Scot Nakagawa about how storytelling has been effectively used by conservatives and the religious right to move power. He goes deep into explaining why all politics is identity politics. He talks about the need to build both the popular front and the united front. This conversation comes all the way from episode 162, but it feels so relevant still today.
I've known Scot Nakagawa. We met in 1992, I think, right around the time that Oregon was melting down with that horrific ballot initiative. We had Donna Red Wing on last week, so it's been kind of old home week. But Scot has just always been a very provocative thinker and made me, in these 25 years, really think about things from a lot of different perspectives. I thought I'd read a little bit of a Facebook post that he made the other day that someone turned into a blog and published. Scot is one of those people who has a salon at his Facebook page, and there's always a really rich and interesting exchange going on. But this is by way of introducing him. The I is Scot, as I read it. So Scot said this: I've spent the past 4 decades as a community servant and advocate. I've run a food bank, managed clinics for low-income people, served as a tutor in literacy programs, and as an executive in philanthropy. I've organized electoral and community-based campaigns, wrote grants, asked literally thousands of people for donations, and even more than once climbed through the open window of a home to interrupt an act of child abuse in communities so remote that police could never be expected to react in time. My story probably sounds like your story if you're a late middle-aged social justice advocate. The 80s were rough. Over those same years, I've also cultivated a role for myself as a movement intellectual. However small my sphere of influence, however meager my share of knowledge, I share what I know and am coming to know. I read and write, listen and discuss, and make half-baked proposals in hopes of receiving critiques, choosing as I do to view criticism as an ally in my lifelong battle against my own vast ignorance. And Scott goes on in this blog post to talk about how anti-intellectualism is really killing the social justice movement. And so he's often lifting up provocative ideas. Let's start with this one, Scott. What do you think if we paid a little more attention to some of what we could have known? How do you think this moment we're in could be different right now? Like, what do you wish people knew that you've seen them not paying attention to lately in the social justice movement?
Well, most of my work involves, resourcing and supporting grassroots organizations, community-based organizations. I'm a bottom-up person, right? I want to create social change from the bottom up. And I've found over many years now that at that level of organizing and activism, that people are often kind of afraid of power. And because I think they don't quite understand how power works. And I think that people have a difficult time of assessing where they fit into a very complex society that is filled with flawed institutions that nonetheless provide us with some protection, so that we should criticize them but not just discard them. I just think that there's a difficult time that people have in making real assessments. My sense of that, though, is that to some degree or another, we've always been that way, but that the problem has become particularly acute since the 80s, since the election of Ronald Reagan, and the way in which that change, that sea change, the rise of the right, forced progressives into kind of a defensive posture. We became pragmatists, and we stopped talking about causation. We started to talk about outcomes and not process. We started to name wins that we really once thought of as compromises, and basically in the hopes of retaining some ability, some traction to move the kinds of policies and change that we want. We lost track of the story we need to be telling to the communities that we're working in order for them to understand where they fit into systems of power. So, I see it as my role to do that. I don't think of myself as the brightest person that you'll ever meet, but what I do know is how people who are ordinary folks who work in organizations understand and see the world. And so I think of myself as kind of a filter. There's a lot of brilliant stuff out there. I filter out all of the things that I think might confuse people and focus on the things that I think might help them move forward so they can reach for those things on their own.
So it seems to me that a lot of what's called intellectualism is tearing things down. It is not using intellectual capital to build or to imagine and construct. Would you share that?
Well, we've been spending a whole lot of time on defense, ever since the 60s, really. And when you're in a defensive posture, criticism is your friend. It helps you to understand your opposition and how to approach it. The problem is that, when criticism becomes all you do, you start to lose track of the need to articulate a forward-moving vision, right? So we become critics. And particularly now, at a time when people are reaching for change and looking for profits, we find ourselves with a deficit of profits.
Where have you seen the most successful grassroots movement in ways that you found really compelling?
Well, there are a couple of different instances I can name. The first one, though, is a kind of a sad instance of the way that the religious right has, expressed itself as a grassroots movement. One of the things that they do really well that we don't is storytelling. They recognize that the transformation of communities happens at a cultural level, and are in their activism also cultural workers. So they work through pre-existing cultural institutions like churches. They infiltrate those institutions when they aren't already present in them. They transform them in ways that make them into vehicles for them to be able to move power and as platforms for profits. So they, for example, took over, local Republican Party organizations all over the country by running stealth candidates for various different kinds of offices, and also just by joining up. right? And becoming the critical mass, the most active minority within the party. And by doing that, demonstrated what a small group of people can do if they're determined enough, and captured control of those party organizations and then start to use them to articulate their agenda. So whereas, you know, on our side, we tend to spend a lot of time building community-based organizations and nonprofits. What they did was they decided to simply take over those that already were rooted in communities and that people identified with, and then turn those institutions into vehicles for them to express their political agenda. So that's one really good example. Another one is in the movement for Hawaiian sovereignty, I think. The movement for Hawaiian sovereignty, when I was a young person living in Hawaii, was mostly articulated as a cultural renaissance. And so you see there's kind of a theme here, right? That cultural renaissance was one of reclaiming and articulating for the public what it meant to be Hawaiian, in a context in which Hawaiians had been humiliated and marginalized and politically disenfranchised. And by doing that, basically we're able to hold a mirror up to the community in which people could see themselves as something other than people living on their knees, but that saw themselves singing and dancing and speaking their own language and articulating a kind of politic that spoke to the deep yearning, the longing that people had to be able to understand themselves separate and apart from the gaze of the colonizer. And by doing that, we're able to actually build a political movement that now is one of the most influential political movements in Hawaii, and certainly in the Native Hawaiian community. Sovereignty organizations are among the most trusted institutions. So in spite of the radical politics, people who even oftentimes think of themselves as culturally conservative, nonetheless identify with those institutions because that connection was made at that deep cultural level. You know, I am completely, you know, just past and over debates about which is more important, race or class, gender or race, race or gender. You know, I mean, all of these different kinds of conversations that deal with gender, race, and class as separate but intersecting phenomena. Right. I actually think that all gender is raced, all race is gendered, you know, class is a gendered and raced experience. And so when you see, for example, what happened in this past election with a minority, but nonetheless the most well-organized minority winning the White House on the basis of a highly, you know, specific and clearly articulated bigoted agenda, I think what you see is people basically reaching for power through a kind of way of talking about the economy and their experiences of being marginalized within the economy through avenues of culture, right? And really addressing it through going down the avenue of gender, going down the avenue of race, and not necessarily talking specifically about capitalism, but basically telling a story about capitalism and their rejection of it. And so, you know, I think that, you know, we waste a lot of time trying to figure out which of those things we should be focusing on more, you know, whether it should be class, which is race. And so when we talk about class without talking about race or gender, we're really talking about white male class, or talking about race, which if we do talk about race without talking about class and talking about gender, we're really talking about middle class male race, right? These kinds of debates need to go away, and that we need to really start to understand that capitalism, which is at the center of all of this, is basically a, you know, socially unified whole that articulates itself in the lives of people, in the way we experience freedom or unfreedom, in terms of gender and race and other forms of, you know, and other ways we understand ourselves in terms of our identities. So with that, I think that, you know, in terms of talking about race with white people, I think we really need to start to recognize that, first of all, when we talk about white people, we're talking about a large mass of people. And we often talk about them as though they're one person, right? As if they're a monolith. And worse than that, we often talk about them like they're monsters, right? That kind of demonizing and that kind of, you know, singularizing, making something that is complex into a overly simplified whole, has the effect of invisibilizing people and making them feel as though they're being erased. And so when we talk about race and we talk about white people in that way, I think we often make white people who are struggling, who are suffering, who don't feel for whom white privilege is not articulated in terms of economic benefit, we make them feel erased and as if they don't matter. And it invites a kind of a contest, right? Is it race or is it our experience? Why is it that liberal elites seem to be talking about race all the time or gender all the time, but they're not talking about us, right? So, it invites this sort of producerism, is what people who study the right wing call it. It's kind of a big word for basically, this whole makers and versus takers meme. This idea that basically liberal elites are giving away the posterity of hardworking white people to minority groups in order to be able to manipulate them, to give them their votes so they can seize power in a way that is against the interests of white working class people, right? So, I think that we need to start to rethink how we talk about race with white people and start to think about what their real issues are and then leverage upward, right? So, when you're talking about poor white people, I worked in Appalachia for a while. And, you see the kind of suffering that people are experiencing. That suffering is the result of capitalism, which is a racial formation as much as it is an economic one, right? In fact, I think of it as a cultural formation that articulates itself in terms of economics and gender and race. And so people, need to be able to see that we recognize their suffering, and that, and then connect that suffering to a broader system of oppression that also marginalizes people on the basis of gender and race. And that's going to need to begin with generosity. I think a lot of what we see now happening in white anti-racist organizing, for example, begins with the very ungenerous place of talking to people about privilege and overestimating it. Right? When we overestimate privilege, we underestimate racism. So, I think it's incredibly important.
Can you say
go
more?
ahead.
Can you say more about that? When we underestimate privilege, when we overestimate privilege, we underestimate racism. Can you say more about that?
Well, privilege is like permission. It's not the same thing as the power to give it, right? And so when we objectify privilege, which is what I think we do, and we make it into this thing, it's like a club. It hits other people over the head. It's something you have. It's something you own and control, when in fact that's not at all the case. We exaggerate privilege, and and it starts to become understood by people as the same thing as power. When power is distinct, it's something quite different, right? Privilege is bestowed by the powerful on those that it is convenient to bestow privilege upon. So, white people, for example, are raced as they are, including Jews and the Irish and Southern Italians who were not once white, in order to maintain a majority. And in order for a tiny minority among that majority to exercise power. So the privilege of being white and being therefore excluded from certain kinds of oppression was bestowed upon those people in order to be able to exercise that kind of unjust power. After this election, for example, white Jews who have experienced white privilege, right, because Jews have been whitened in the United States, European Jews, suddenly in a moment saw that privilege start to evaporate, because this election was won by the Trump campaign on the basis of an anti-Semitic meme, right? That's the fragility of privilege. It's something that we make too much of, and when we do that, we underestimate the power that racism gives to those who are bestowing that privilege on people in order to maintain that power.
Scott, you talked earlier about sort of inserting ourselves in the debates that are happening on the right, and I'm wondering if you see a particular opportunity or place for I'll use the term liberating religious traditions. It's one that Rebecca Parker brought to us last week on the VUU, but a particular place for those religious traditions that see themselves as part of work for liberation and justice in inserting themselves in those debates.
Well, I think that, drawing from my experience working with the Urban Rural Mission, one of the things that people would say to me is that the Gospels are the story of Jesus and culture is the story of communities. And those two stories have been at odds with one another too often, right? And so I think one of the things that we need to do is start to articulate, the kind of Christian belief systems in ways that are invite reconciliation with communities. I think that there's the possibility of appealing to the base of the Christian right, even if maybe not so much to the leadership, and to start to, basically talk in terms that people understand about the issues that we represent through our religious partners in order to try to split their base. I think at the leadership level, there are a lot of different things. I think that the Christian right, for example, is not at all necessarily the friend of other elements of the right, particularly paramilitary organizations and others who are articulating a more explicit white nationalist agenda. And I think that we need to make that really clear by helping people to understand exactly what that agenda is. There's also, I think, a powerful strain of anti-authoritarianism being expressed on the other side, and that I think that we need to start to talk about what that means. What we saw in this election was a rejection of centrist politics and liberal elitism, right? Both on the right and the left, actually, and kind of reach for something other than kind of traditional liberal solutions to problems. We saw a rejection also of big government, which is ironic because I think that Trump doesn't necessarily represent the kind of small government right-wing politic that we've become accustomed to, and authoritarianism, both perceived and real. And so I think that there are many different currents like that that run through all of the different parts of the right that at the level of the base that I think aren't being answered by the leadership. And so people are basically rejecting and then opting for other, basically, voting in the category other, as opposed to specifically choosing, for the most part, their agenda. We need to keep in mind that Trump only won a minority of the vote, right? Hillary Clinton actually won the plurality, and the majority of votes went to other candidates. And so, the fact is that most people did not vote for Trump. Trump won with the electoral majority, which is basically just about organizing, right? The reality is that most people didn't choose him, and over 60% of people who didn't think he would win, which suggests that there may be a significant number of those people who are protest voters. And we see already that many of them are starting to experience some buyer's remorse. We need to encourage that kind of buyer's remorse by giving people the opportunity to pivot away from Trump and make that a heroic act, as opposed to force them to play the goat and admit with shame what they did, right?
So we have a question from the live audience that are watching right now, asking for you, and it was my question as well, for you to share concrete examples of coalition building. Where do we start? Because everything you're saying is on point. Where do we begin with reaching out to folks who, as we've learned, aren't on our Facebook feed because they're divided? So where do we begin? What are some concrete steps?
Well, the problem with coalition building is that it always has to begin with the kind of coalition of those who are most clear about where we need to go, right? In this moment, we need to, these are, so trigger warning, these terms are terms that in another generation were weaponized against us, but we need to build both the Popular Front and the United Front, right? So the Popular Front needs to be the broadest possible coalition. It needs to include moderate Republicans, for example. It needs to include everyone who recognizes the danger of this moment and the kind of authoritarianism that might be expressed through this administration. And that Popular Front needs to be, as diverse as possible. So it needs to include those who, for example, voted for Trump, but then have decided they don't want to go there anymore, right? That actually were able to overlook his bigotry in order to be able to reject liberalism. And but we also need the United Front. And I think that that's one of the places where we can really dig in and start to think about what we need to be doing. We need to start articulate what is the politic of this moment? How do we claim a place in the political struggles of this time that isn't just an endorsement of flawed strategies and flawed, kind of institutions. We were forced in this election by history, many of us, or at least this is how I see it, right, to choose Hillary Clinton. I did not wish Hillary Clinton to be president. I chose her because history demanded that we choose somebody other than Trump who had a viable chance of winning. that kind of having to choose the lesser of two evils is a problem, in that people recognize that really broadly, right? They recognize that there are no good choices here. And when you force people into that kind of situation, they get angry and they reject, right? So I think that the United Front needs to start to think about, exactly what it is that we represent moving forward. How do we build an alternative to this? How do we capture the kind of currency and the meaning of this time? I say this often to people, but neoliberalism is just late capitalism. We're already in the middle of a giant transition. Whatever will happen next will not necessarily be just a natural evolution into something better. It could get to be something quite a bit worse. But in fact, we are in a time when many things are changing, and many of the kinds of political containers for our aspirations, nation states and local governments and whatnot, are going to have to pivot really, really dramatically. We need to be in there proposing an alternative to what's happening now, because keeping it the same is not going to be a thing that's going to happen regardless, right? It's going to change no matter what. And so the people with the clearest vision of what the alternative should look like are going to win that argument. We need to figure out what that is within that United Front coalition. Just to get really specific, in the 80s, when I first got involved with fighting the right, I was one of many people who responded to a very brutal murder in Portland of an Ethiopian student named Mulugeta Surah. He was beaten to death with baseball bats and kicked to death, really, and beaten to death by neo-Nazi skinheads. Those skinheads were part of a much broader neo-Nazi uprising that was happening in the Northwest and around the country at the time. And in order to be able to respond to that situation, we had to build a coalition. The police weren't reporting on this adequately. They weren't responding to the situation by giving us real facts. They were telling us that, in fact, there were no real organized neo-Nazi groups in Portland, that this was just a minor marginal problem. They were drawing false equations between neo-Nazis and those who were opposed to them. And so we recognized that this wasn't going to be a simple matter of, groups getting together and going to law enforcement and demanding a solution, that we needed to build a kind of a movement in the city. And so we basically reached out to everyone who was opposed to neo-Nazi skinhead activity, which was most people, right? Almost everyone. Even the tourism board is opposed to there being neo-Nazi political groups running around beating people up in your city, because it's really bad for business, right? So we reached out to all of those groups, and we built a very broad coalition in order to be able to create the political space within which a smaller group of people could organize themselves to begin to explain what was happening to people, to help them understand why this uprising was occurring and what it meant that in a liberal city like Portland, we had this incredible problem, and connect that to the history of the state as a white supremacist and racially exclusionary state, to the demographics of the state, the way that it attracted waves of white flight from other parts of the country because of the racial exclusionary laws, and then to connect that set of racial exclusionary laws to the kinds of policies that we have in place now that similarly attract that kind of base for reactionary politics. So, we had to do research, we had to do a bunch of different things, but we couldn't do it without the space of that broad coalition in order to form a committee, basically, that then could do that work. But the committee then deployed itself to deploy what it was creating, the research documents and strategies that it was developing through a lot of different avenues. So we, for example, helped to organize something called People of Faith Against Bigotry, that then organized themselves to do education through the pews and to mobilize their people when other groups were attacked, right? So you could do a mass mobilization if somebody's home was attacked or someone was, brutalized in the streets or being threatened. And through those actions, people could come together and then see one another, in candlelight visuals and whatnot, who in spaces that, they were unaccustomed to, and in situations across differences that they weren't accustomed to working across, and find common cause. So we did that, and we did it through a variety of different avenues. We connected ACT UP to Skinheads Against Racial Prejudice. We helped to organize a group called Anti-Racist Action and mobilize them to be able to, kind of work in the alternative music scene where neo-Nazi skinheads were recruiting people and defeat them by competing for the attention of those at their immediate projected base of support. Right, using the symbols, using the language that they were accustomed to, working with local bands, and trying to build a culture of resistance to what's happening in the music scene, where the intimidation of neo-Nazi skinheads was having the effect of a minority ruling a majority. But in little ways like that, we pieced it together. by the time we were done, that we were, well on our way, we still hadn't necessarily won any support from the local police. And, some of us who were the more militant members of the group, I was in my 20s at the time and really wanted to just, go hand to hand, were calling for an escalation of tactics. But, calmer people, cooler heads basically prevailed and convinced us that we should organize a major march. It was a March for Dignity and Diversity. And this was one of those times when we called the Popular Front to attention and then mobilized them in the streets. And by doing that and, publicizing it in the media, we basically created the room for city leaders like the mayor and members of city council to be able to pivot. So they weren't choosing between this group over here of, left-wing anti-racists and this group over here of neo-Nazi fascists. But they could choose another position that allowed them to be able to articulate a position on the part of city leadership that then would open the door to police reform in the city of Portland.
Thank you, Scott. Finally, we speak with Reverend Dr. Nathan Walker, the Community Minister of Religion and Public Life here at the Church of the Larger Fellowship. We reflect on the totalitarian rhetoric and behavior in political discourse in the United States, and how that correlates with a startling rise in social hostilities and violence. This discussion comes from episode 234.
Nate, tell us what you see. You've been studying this, the continuum of violence and how religion plays into it.
So right now we are in an age of contempt. And I use that word very, very specifically, drawing upon some psychological studies that look at marriage. They look at 30 different years of studies of couples. And if one of them is showing contempt for another, the psychologist can predict with 90% accuracy that they're going to have a divorce. And I think ultimately our country is going through a divorce. We're seeing these elements of contempt that start out with nonverbals, like in political debates, the rolling of the eyes, the dismissing, the scoffing, the sarcasm that's very, very biting, that lacks any kind of generosity. So you get to see sort of the early stages of contempt in our body language and in our actual language. And what's happening right now is that we are a public that is more divided than we've seen in history. So some of the polls show that out-group animus and in-group favoritism is at an all-time high. The political views held by both Democrats and Republicans are more divergent than in recorded history. So we are in an age where there's
when you say recorded history, you mean U.S.
U.S. history.
Certainly other places have gotten more divided. Okay, I just want to.
I should say since the recording of this same topic, which was in the 1920s, right? So when they're looking at behavior and values shared by parties and so on. The other thing is we're getting to see a lot of otherizing language. Meg and I worked on the book Cultivating Empathy together, and that where we talk about sort of listening in for the rhetoric of otherizing when somebody is being demonized or being colonized or generalized or trivialized or homogenized or vaporized. These are ways that to make somebody the other. And when that happens, you can justify their elimination. And this otherizing is taking on a whole new power right now. And so one of the things we're seeing in the demographics is an increase in social hostilities, hate crimes, violence. Anti-Semitism is at an all-time high. Hate crimes against Muslims are higher in this last year, according to FBI data, than they were after 9/11 or any other time. This rhetoric of having 42 different states sort of introduce laws to ban Sharia, the travel ban itself and the political rhetoric around that to create a registry of
Hold
Muslims.
on, I missed something. 42 states did what?
42 states have introduced anti-Sharia bills, meaning to ban the use of religious justifications that Muslims might use in living their lives. And so it's based on this perception that one, Islam is foreign, and that's what these copycat bills say, is banning foreign religion. And the courts overwhelmingly find them unconstitutional. Because of course they are. You can't establish religion. You can't privilege one over another or privilege religion over non-religion. And so what's strange is that governors continue to sign into law these bills they know are unconstitutional. Sam Brownback of Kansas was one of them, and he was now appointed by President Trump to be the ambassador for religious freedom in the United States, for the United States. And so when looking at this, I'm seeing that it's a kind of political strategy that's a perfect recipe. If I get the public to fear the other, in this case, Muslims, then you need me to protect you from them. And if the courts overrule me, then you need me in order to appoint new justices. So it's a perfect political recipe for maintaining power, for rallying a base. So this is
and I would add that just that it's on the ballot, just that it's being given the cover, the protection of something that should be debated, that should be something that we look at from a perspective of not just politics, but law and values. Just that nugget alone, that it should be part of the public discourse, to have this debate, is part of the tactic of yes to everything you just said, Nate, of all those other steps, but even just the kernel of how it grows, that this is something that is worthy of protection from, is part of that entire, not just othering, but shifting of where our attention is and goes to.
That's right. That's exactly right. And I think it's in this time you're beginning to see the legitimization of otherizing, and it is resulting in actual discrimination, actual hate crimes, actual incitement to violence. And I'll give you a couple examples. So at Liberty University, for instance, is the fourth largest private school in the country. And Jerry Falwell, as the president of it, just in 2015, was speaking in front of a huge auditorium of students, talking 10,000 students. And this is what he said: "I've always thought if more good people had concealed carry permits, then we could end those Muslims before they walked in and killed them." The crowd then erupted in applause. You can watch this on YouTube. It's incredibly disturbing. And then he continued and said, "I wanted to take this opportunity to encourage all of you to get your gun permit. We offer a free course. Let's teach them a lesson if they ever show up here." This is the president's advisor on religion and public life. And he's calling for his students to take up arms if a Muslim enters their campus. So this is an incitement to violence, right? And so when asked a week later, "Did you really mean this?" he said, "If I had to say what I said again, I'd say exactly the same thing." And so it's in this context that we're seeing all kinds of rises of hate crimes against Muslims in particular. So right now, 1 in 5 families are experiencing, Muslim families are experiencing some kind of act of bullying of their child in public schools. And then of those families, of those children who are experiencing that, the bully, 1 out of 4 times, are the teachers. So an example is like a public school teacher is ripping off a 8th grade girl's hijab, her headscarf, and he's petting her hair, saying, pretty hair, pretty hair. And he says, you need to liberate yourself. Aren't you a feminist? And how do we know that this happened? Because he himself recorded it on his phone and posted it. So if the president and his advisors are saying these negative things toward the vulnerable minorities of our time, then other public officials, in this case, public school teachers, are 1 in 4 likely to be the actual perpetrators of bullying in the schools.
The violence that can be done with decrees like that, we know, Nate, and you know much more in detail about how behavior like that on the part of authority figures gives permission to the already rampant, as Aisha said, this isn't new, but it's picking on people who are the most vulnerable and who are already targeted, and who they have probably done focus groups to decide they can afford to lose. I know politics well enough to know that they did that. So I'm curious, Nate, when you see something like that, it goes into your brain in different ways than my mother's brain, which just goes to wanting to go fight with somebody. But what do you do?
I draw upon this theory of change, which is to count to 5. Think of a 1 is somebody who is ideologically very, very different than a 5. They have different views, so much so that they often don't even hear one another. They don't understand their rhetoric. They cannot actually communicate. But the 2 and the 3 and the 4, who are sort of represent the spectrum of views on that, tend to be sort of caught in that extremism between this and that. A 3, who is sort of the middle of the road on these topics, can often speak to both the 1 and the 5. In this theory, you can only really speak 2 more than where you're at. So a 2 and a 4 can communicate with each other, but they can't communicate to the other side. So what I tend to do is, in an age of extremes, not to speak to the extreme as a strategy in order to keep those who are 2, 3, 4 morally grounded, to keep the 2, 3, 4s somehow to differentiate them and to educate as a strategy. Now, there's definitely the storm the castle, shut down the conversation that needs to happen. These are ultimate strategies, and this is just one other in our toolkit for reform. So in that context, one of the things I do when I hear about the sort of the separation of families, I'll ask somebody, for instance, who was raised in Pennsylvania. This is a conversation I had just a couple of weeks ago. I said, "Oh, well, yeah, what are your insights about that?" And then they talk about how immigration's a problem and the caravans are coming, and there's all, no, I don't necessarily think Mexicans are rapists. I'm not that extreme, but I do think that this is a major issue, and so I support his policy, right? So there's like a 2 on the 1 of the extreme scale. And so I just ask a factual question. Oh, well, do you know the origins of this? And they're like, no, well, what's the origins? And they're like, oh, didn't Jeff Sessions start it in 2007, in 2018? I was like, no, the real origins. And that is George Washington in 1790 until Eisenhower in 1954, they all had one legal definition of citizen: white. You had to be white in order to become a US citizen. We're talking 36 presidents had this. We're talking multiple Supreme Courts reaffirming this, countless Congresses reaffirming this. So the basis of this idea of immigration in this legal system is based on whiteness. And so when I asked them, oh, well, certainly you know the stories of the federal government hiring Christian missionaries in order to create federal boarding schools to separate the adult indigenous families from the children, and in order to Christianize the children, cutting off their hair, removing their garb, changing their names, requiring them to speak English, and converting them to Christianity. You know the federal government funded that for over 70 years, and over 200,000 children were then converted to Christianity that way. They're like, what? That doesn't happen. And I was like, well, you know other contemporary examples of this with after Bill Clinton signed the NAFTA agreement, 1.5 million Mexican farmers lost their corn farm industry. And then American businesses would come over and bus them over for temporary work visas and say, oh, sorry, the temporary work visa is gone, but we'll go ahead and allow you to work here, but you'll be undocumented. And many of these undocumented workers work in the meatpacking industry, as articulated in Food Inc., where you have 10 to 15 people who are undocumented picked out by ICE each day so as to not disrupt the workforce. So this is a government business collaboration in order to create undocumented workers, one. Two, to then raid them in the middle of the night. And they're usually the ones who are making some kind of complaint about the health conditions of these meatpacking industries. And then three, separating the adults from the children right then and there. So this idea that separating of families is somehow, one, new, and two, somehow should be shocking is actually a continuation of a long-standing legal administrative attempt in order to otherize, in order to protect a certain type of person, in order to otherize another. So for me, these are the types of conversations I try and have in order to help people not go to further into an extreme, but to ground them into some history.
And how did that conversation go with a person from Pennsylvania? Did they care about any of that?
They sometimes say, "Oh yeah, I knew about that," but I don't think they did necessarily. Or they'll kind of have a reaction of it's like when you see somebody have a paradigm shift right then and there, and they're like caught in of like, but that's not my narrative. Like you get to see this kind of incongruence, and so I like that kind of using education to disrupt our narrative. I like the idea of using that as a strategy. And I'm going to be very, very blunt here. Too many Unitarian Universalists think their congregation is a country club. No, it is a training ground. It is a training ground for moral, spiritual development. It is a training ground on how to do that emancipatory work in order to live out our deepest values. And that has to come with a very big and beautiful and ugly mirror into our character. So if there's any kind of resistance when it comes to, oh, you need to talk pretty and look nice in order for me to hear, then there's a fundamental misunderstanding of why we gather. We're not gathering for a social club and to have tea. What? We're here because it's a training ground, people. And so I think if we start to shift to what is the purpose of this place and get people to buy into that larger purpose, then maybe they will see each sermon, each encounter, each conflict as an opportunity for their own moral and intellectual and spiritual development.
Thank you for joining us. Special thanks to those of you who give generously to this ministry. It is because of you that this ministry is possible. You can click the link in the description to give now, or visit CLFUU.org/give for more information. We hope you will join us next week for another episode of The VUU.